All good?
Yeah,
All right.
I think so.
I want you guys to be upfront with questions too. Yeah. Organizing stuff, you guys are you're the teachers. So,
Hey, how you doing?
Pretty good, how are you?
Good, thanks.
I'm gonna talk for about a half hour and then I'll introduce you all one at a time. This is Hill. Alexis does those stuff.
Testing, testing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Testing.
Okay, thank you.
Good. Cool.
Oh, it's really cool.
It sounded great yesterday.
Steve, did you want to do the introduction, Steve, or?
I'm sorry?
Did-
Yes.
Maybe one or two more minutes.
Okay, just let me know.
Some people people couldn't find around.
Oh, okay. Anything, well, you were gonna mention anything, so I don't need to get into a lot of detail, obviously.
Yeah, yeah. Got a pretty robust presentation.
Hello, how are you?
You got a lot of people on YouTube?
We have two so far.
Cool.
Oh, we have 2 likes. We have 3 people.
All right, cool. You have it on Zoom or do you have it?
YouTube.
Oh, YouTube.
Yeah, Steve, whenever you wanna
Ready?
kick it off, yeah.
Okay.
Oh.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. And thanks for coming this afternoon. My name is Steve Del Castillo, and I'm the director for New Directions program here. It's the weekend program. I'll share more about that later after Professor Walsh's presentation. But I want to welcome everybody to our presentation around the labor movement. One of the reasons that we wanted to do this is in New Directions we have a couple of tracks, what we call tracks, and one of those tracks is labor leadership. It's really all about the labor movement and what it takes to be able to lead in the labor movement. We've had the opportunity to work with a lot of organizations and of course as you're going to see students. Also a chance to learn more about the labor movement, and I know that's something probably, quite frankly, a lot of folks don't know about for a variety of reasons. But that's something we're trying to kind of rejuvenate, and I'll share more about that later. right now, I want to introduce Professor Jim Walsh. Many of you probably know Professor Walsh. But Professor Walsh is, he's an expert in labor history, and probably those of you that have taken classes through know that. But wanted to share about Professor Walsh's perspective on the labor movement. And more importantly, to share with you some of the work that he's been doing in Landville and some of the other areas. And then what we're going to do is Professor Walsh will do his presentation. I'll then share some things with you, and then we'll have a Q&A session. Jim, do you want to take questions as you go through the process, or do you want to?
Maybe at the end.
At the end, okay. Then we'll wait till the end for questions, so please jot them down. Before we get started, any questions from anybody? Nope, you're all set? Cool. Got your water and everything? All right. Professor Walsh?
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Steve, for that introduction. It's great to be here, everyone. It's great to see many of my students, colleagues. It's great to be in person. It's great to feel some energy and some life on campus. And it's wonderful to start to bring back this series that is so important to our department. So I'm going to do my best today to enter all of us into this important topic of labor today and what's happening. We all know that something's happening, something important. But I think that the challenge is to really identify and understand what that is. So I'm also going to try to center not really my voice, but the voice of students today. We have, as Steve said, a labor program for the first time in maybe forever on this campus. And we're trying to grow that program and keep it healthy. And so you're going to hear today from a few students who are organizers. You know, almost all of our students work. So our students are not just students, they're student workers. They're sons and daughters and brothers and sisters and all of that. And so there's some dynamic organizing happening among our students that the tables have really been turned. I feel like I'm learning more from them than they are from me. So you'll learn from them today as well. So anyway, I'm just feeling good today. The weather's rising and the virus is falling, and it's a good day. Our thoughts today are also with the people of Ukraine, of course, and I want to make sure that's not lost in the shuffle as well. That's sort of hanging over the world, the anxiety of that moment. So let's begin with a short video, just a couple of minutes, and then we're going to go forward from there. So I'm not going to introduce it. I'll let you absorb it.
About unions, including any specific concerns about particular unions involved in organizing. And we share our preference for a direct working relationship frequently and boldly, even when no organizing activity has occurred. You will learn about the warning signs most commonly associated with early union organizing, as well as other warning signs that could indicate associate disengagement, vulnerability to organizing, or early organizing activity. While employees have the right to organize, we have a right and responsibility to share our position that a direct working relationship is better for the customer, the company, and the associate. In order to be able to do that effectively, it is critical that we recognize the early warning signs of potential organizing and escalate concerns promptly. If you see warning signs of potential organizing, notify your building HRM and GM site leader immediately. HRMs and GM site leaders should notify their assigned ER managers or ER principal immediately. The most obvious signs would include use of words associated with unions or union-led movements like living wage or steward, petitions or other concerted activity such as an associate purporting to speak on behalf of his or her coworkers when raising concerns, union graffiti, union t-shirts, hats, jackets, or other clothing, union flyers, and union visitors in or near the parking lot. Some signs are less obvious than finding the actual union flyer, but they can still indicate associate disengagement, which is itself a warning sign for potential organizing. Examples include associates who normally aren't connected to each other suddenly hanging out together, associates who are close suddenly stop speaking to each other, groups of associates scatter when approached by management, increased associate negativity, anger, or confrontation, unusual complaints or change in passion or detail around complaints, unusual interest in policies, benefits, employee lists, or other company information, or any other associate behavior that is out of character. For example, an associate who normally leaves promptly begins hanging out in the break room for an hour after work each day. In order to recognize warning signs, it is critical that you know what an associate's normal behavior looks like. Often, it is the change in behavior.
Demonization of unions. And what's interesting about this is a different message than the kind of historical right-wing anti-union narrative we're used to. You know, we're used to the National Guard and the Ludlow Massacre and that sort of narrative. But this is a much more, this is anti-unionism that's framed in a progressive tone. And that makes it, I argue, much more dangerous and insidious. So I started with this photo from the Ludlow Massacre, just to ground us where we are right now. We are in sacred ground. The history of labor in Colorado is full of this struggle, and this is a history that's often not a part of our high school or middle school. It's almost always not a part of high school or middle school history. And so one of the things I want to emphasize today is the lack of labor education that exists nationwide, really. And that's part of the big problem, is that students leave their education without an understanding of the trajectory of this struggle, without an understanding of the foundation of the struggle, and the events and the people behind it. And when a student leaves their education without that understanding, they're vulnerable. And so this is the reason that students who do this work inspire me so much, is that they've overcome, that biased education, I suppose you could say. So there is something happening today, and it's something I've never witnessed in my lifetime. And I'm in my 50s. So what's happening? The media refers to this as the Great Resignation. And so I want to start there. There's this sort of funny a litany of notes that workers have left when they've walked off the job nationally. And these notes are always treated as sort of laughing points and or maybe even as indication that workers are lazy and that sort of narrative. But what's really not looked at with these notes is the underlying consciousness that they reveal. And that's what I want to focus on today and argue today, is that this is not the Great Resignation. This is a rising of consciousness among mostly younger workers, a new generation that we haven't seen in a long, long time. And the strike wave that we're witnessing, we haven't seen yet it being reflected in a rise in union density, but I believe that's coming. I believe that's on the way. So up on the main sign of Burger King, and here's a series of a few, and again the underlying consciousness in just these documents reveal a lot. Capitalism will destroy this country if you don't pay people enough to live their lives. Why should they slave away for you? So think about that message. And so what we're seeing with the people walking away from work that's exploitative and dehumanizing is the realization that there's a better world out there. There's a better situation out there. So, Dollar General doesn't pay a living wage or treat their employees with respect. thank you for all the sodas, Joe. So they grabbed some sodas on their way out the door. And so again, this is, these are living documents of the 21st century labor movement. I was attacked at work by a drunk employee, and my boss won't fire him because he's too lazy to work the open shift, so I quit. They reveal a workspace today that we know is incredibly abusive. Verbal abuse, physical abuse, that can be very unsafe. And a workspace today where workers are controlled and monitored, surveillance on workspaces. Amazon has really made this into a science, the way that more and more production can be squeezed out of workers for less and less pay. So that's not new, by the way. That's the old struggle against scientific management. And so we're seeing more than just people resigning. This is not the Great Resignation. This is the Great Uprising. This involves strikes. The custodians at DIA won, I think it was a $4 an hour raise. King Soopers, you all know this. King Soopers just won a strike which involved quite a large pay raise, better benefits, better safety on the workplace. Workers are tired of being patted on the back and being called essential workers, being patted on the back and being called heroes, and then there's no real reward with that. There's no compensation with that. And so that feeds what we're seeing today as well. So I just want to go over some of the related issues to this new consciousness. Since the 60s, minimum wage has not kept pace with inflation. And so minimum wage is not even close to a living wage today. And the percentage of our population that live at minimum or just above minimum wage has also grown. So that's a huge piece to what's happening today. The surge in the hiring of temporary contract workers, people who aren't considered employees, don't have access to benefits or protections. Since the Great Recession of 2008, an enormous percentage of new jobs created since then have been these temporary contract jobs. As I said, the lack of labor education, the lack of, we're very good at building a nationalist consciousness in the United States, but we're not good at building a class consciousness in our education system. And so that has to be a part of it. The pandemic, there's been a lot of discussion and debate about how has the pandemic contributed to this, and it's hard to really pin that down. It's difficult. Clearly the pandemic has caused people to reflect on what's important, their priorities, fulfillment, and life is short. And so, and also the whole essential worker issue as well. So that's a piece of it. The examples of organizing, examples of struggle for human dignity that we witness over the past 5 or so years, Black Lives Matter, Standing Rock, the immigrant rights movement, all of this fuels the labor movement as well. And it always has. It always has. The labor movement always has been deeply connected to larger movements. The increased use of technology, workers feeling constrained. I mean, I think our students could speak to this. Feeling controlled. Ask a Amazon driver, a UPS driver. Ask them about how their every movement is monitored, and you'll get an education from that. Lack of healthcare, affordable healthcare, is a huge issue. The demonization of unions, which is not new, of course, but so the old school demonization of union was just crush any organizing that existed and treat leaders as if they were criminals. Union busting with a progressive voice is more difficult to identify, and that's what makes it, as I said earlier, more dangerous. But it usually is along the lines of, we're not anti-union, but we have a culture here that is, we have an open door. We can solve any problem. We don't need a union. We don't need a third party, to get in the way. We've always had a good relationship with our people. That sort of rhetoric is very common today. These Starbucks is not an organization you would paint as coming out of the traditional right-wing anti-union. I'm sure Starbucks management considers themselves a very progressive organization, as does Amazon. REI is another. So I'm gonna keep going because I wanna make sure we have time for the students as well. So the minimum wage. This is hard to see, but this would be the minimum wage, the lighter line, and this would be worker productivity. So that's what we've seen over the past several decades, is that workers are producing. That trajectory has increased, but the minimum wage, the value of the minimum wage has gone down. So what is your time worth? Is kind of where we're at. The quit rate, it has gone up, but it hasn't gone up in a huge way. And again, I recently heard someone in my own family say, we're paying for workers to not work. So that mentality of the lazy workers taking advantage of the system, that has to be confronted, and in the movement, in the labor community as well. So I don't want to use too many graphs, but so I'm going to skip some of this. Union density. This is important. The red line is the percentage of workers that are organized. So where are we? And it peaked in the 50s, around 35%. That's a lot. Since the 50s, there's been a nosedive. And today we're in single digits. I think maybe, I'm going to say like 8 or 9%. The only exception to that is public employees. And you can see with the green line that since about the 70s, the numbers of public employees organized has gone up. And that's the target of anti-union voices today, is targeting public unions. Scott Walker in Wisconsin in 2011, many of you remember that moment when there was an uprising, workers in the streets, workers in the Capitol, taking collective bargaining rights away from public employees. And of course, this is what we're trying to get past here in Colorado, is public workers having collective bargaining rights. Collective bargaining rights was enshrined in the 30s legislation, and to this day is the most important worker legislation that exists. Union density, union membership in blue, the share of income going to the top 10% in red. An inverse relationship between union density and disparity of wealth. Those two are closely tied together. So, I'm going to just hit on some of these historical points quickly. Why has union density declined so drastically? The Taft-Hartley Act, passed during the McCarthy era, gutted many of the gains made in the Wagner Act and the National Labor Relations Act, and set workers back in that, banned secondary boycotts, closed shop with some exceptions, really was the precursor to the right to work movement that we have today, that we're facing today. The CIO was targeted during those years. The CIO has the incredibly progressive history to it. Was organizing workers across racial boundaries and gender boundaries at a time when that was really almost non-existent in our society. But the CIO was target number one in the McCarthy era, and it purged its best organizers and aligned with the AFL, seeing that would give it some political cover. So the PATCO strike of the 80s, many of you remember that, the air traffic controller strike. What makes that important is, you know, how Reagan dealt with that was by firing them wholesale and then recognizing another union, that he's sort of a puppet union. That gave permission to corporations to follow suit. That's so the symbolic meaning of that. That was the President of the United States when he did that, it sort of gave this permission for this to be followed. So that strike was a very important moment in this downward decline that we see today. I've mentioned the targeting today of public work. So the right to work movement today, I think half or maybe even more than half of the states are now right to work states. We have some labor experts here that know some of these more details better than I do. But so right to work is a method of banning the closed shop. The only way labor's ever strong is when there's a closed shop. A closed shop, you're there, you're in the union. And it makes workers strong. Workers have strength in a closed shop. So the right to work is sort of banning that practice to the degree that workers have, you know, choice. Choice is such a, Americans love the politics of choice. And so that's made it a very insidious law to confront. But think about this, if you're in a union shop and you make $5 an hour more than the non-union, and then some people in your shop decide, oh, they're not going to be in the union, they're going to stop paying dues. Well, they're freeloading on the work that the union's done. So try to see it through that lens of, you know, you make this wage because you're in a union, so you have a responsibility toward that. I think that the rhetorical battle over right to work is evolving as we speak, and it's ongoing. So pay attention to that. And then, of course, the trend in hiring of temporary gig contract workers. How many of you have done temporary gig contract work? All right. Here we go, right to work states. So Colorado's not, but close to a right to work state. You can see it almost mirrors the political map, red versus blue, right to work and non-right to work. It's very, very closely mirrors that map. Although, interestingly, you know, up here in the Rust Belt, the heart of labor culture in the United States, Michigan, Indiana, you know, it's the heart of the auto industry and the steel industry, manufacturing base. And this is also where Trump won in 2016. So I want to also center that relationship, the relationship with Trump's victory and the decline of union density. That's an important relationship. One of the most important roles unions have ever played is educating their members. People who have not had access to higher education have been, you know, denied that access, and many historically, the education received through a union is the only education workers can receive. And the decline of union density has meant that educational opportunities haven't been there. So. By the way, the rise, you all saw how the rise beginning in the 60s of public worker unions took off in the 60s and 70s. That's directly related to the civil rights movement. And that movement culture, most famously in Memphis, Tennessee, when sanitation workers launched a wildcat strike, and public employees did not have that right in Tennessee at that time. They just did it. They knew they had the moral high ground, so they just did it. And this ended up being one of the most important and symbolic. Of course, this also led to the tragic death of Martin Luther King. He went to Memphis to help the workers. So again, this important relationship between the civil rights movement and labor, that hasn't always been a symbiotic relationship. There is a long history of racism within the labor. That needs to be confronted as well, and continues to be confronted. But labor continues to be this sort of hope for democracy, real democracy within the labor movement. This is Wisconsin. This is the numbers of people in the streets of Wisconsin. I don't remember how many, in the hundreds of thousands, just massive. And this was really the kind of Rust Belt union culture that is increasingly fallen by the wayside. You know, these states have become really toss-ups politically, and that didn't used to be the case. I made up an acronym for corporations that are progressive and everything but their own workers' rights. So start using it, maybe it'll catch on.
You could add a UM to that, pablum, kind of thing.
Yeah. And this is so common. I mean, an example of that is REI. They vote tomorrow in New York City on a union. And this was REI's response. We have an open door. Just come to us, and there's nothing we can't solve. We're progressive. So that's where it's at today. Is that message is more difficult to combat. Progressive in all but labor. They vote tomorrow, so pay attention to that. So one of the most recognized movements today, of course, is Starbucks. The two stores in Buffalo, 2 of the 3 won. One in Phoenix just won. And there's, I believe, over 100 nationally stores that are going for a vote for the National Labor Relations Board. So this is huge, and it also is an indication of why corporations are so, Walmart and Amazon are so adamant about keeping every single movement snuffed out, because they understand if one succeeds, then others will find courage, and that's what we see today in Starbucks across the country. There's a couple of stores locally here that are unionizing. Next time you're in Starbucks, you might whisper to the person handing you your coffee. Oh yeah, we have some Starbucks workers here actually today. So the tactics Starbucks have been using, hiring union busting firms, that's not new. They call themselves, I forget the term, union adverse or union persuaders or anti-union persuaders or something like that. Delay the vote, stall tactics, draw the vote out, give the corporation time to pressure the workers, time to intimidate the workers, time to do any tactics possible to draw that out. Starbucks' strategy has been to say to the NLRB, individual stores don't have the right to unionize. If these stores in Buffalo want to unionize, then all the workers in Buffalo need to vote together. If these stores in Phoenix want to unionize, then all those workers in all those stores need to vote together. Starbucks knowing that if they can get a regional vote, they'll win. And so, fortunately, the NLRB, I think, voted against that strategy, and that's the thing. We have an NLRB that's much better than in the previous administration. That's another important piece to the puzzle. Captive audience meetings, you know, forcing workers to sit through those videos, to sit through all the propaganda they can throw at them to convince them. Bring executives into the stores themselves. The first stores in Buffalo to organize, suddenly top level Starbucks executives showed up in those stores. Workers were like, "What are you doing?" They're like, "Oh, we're just here to help," you know. But the workers knew what this was an intimidation tactic, and it didn't work. Expand. I already mentioned that one. An anti-union website. An anti-union website. I think I might have a. So this is Starbucks. This is part of that they made this anti-union website, and it reads, "Partners, we have a 50-year history of working together with transparency and having open conversation with respect to honesty. It's part of what makes Starbucks a different kind of company. We're progressive. Today's no different. We know that some partners are considering unionizing, and know that you may have questions about that. We do not believe unions are necessary at Starbucks, because we know that the real issues are solved through our direct partnerships with one another. And we believe every partner deserves to know the facts and to make their own decision." So again, this idea that a collective voice, let's just sit down and talk. We can solve anything. We're Starbucks. So this is, again, they're very careful not to frame any of this rhetoric in kind of traditional anti-union, ways. So it's. I think this is the focus today of the movement should be, is on how to counter this. So what's happening in the 21st century? There's some great uses of social media. Coworker.org, if you haven't ever seen that, you can launch a campaign. Any worker can launch a campaign on coworker.org, create a petition, and corporations respond to those petitions because they're so tuned into their social media presence. So there's been a lot of success just around little issues like the right to appear as you are, within reason, on the workplace. So it's not all about healthcare and pay, it's about so many different issues. The Fight for 15, which Denver was a big part of, raising the minimum wage, and now it needs raised more. And so that was huge. Led really by immigrant workers. The labor movement immigrant workers have always been at the forefront of the labor movement in this country. TikTok videos. Anyone seen any Amazon workers in warehouses making TikTok videos? And some of them take off and become really popular, and they have an influence. There was a one I saw recently that's going viral where a worker was on their lunch break, eating as fast as they could, and the supervisor came in, "What are you doing?" And then he got up and had to run back to his job, and it's like 15 seconds, but that took off because that was the feeling workers have of not even having time to put food into your body in a healthy way. Graduate student organizing is huge today. I read this, something like a fourth of the United Auto Workers is graduate students. And think about that. You've got old school infrastructure of organizing the UAW. Now, in the University of Pittsburgh, it's United Steelworkers, I think. And then you've got young graduate students coming together in this way, Columbia just had through a huge struggle to be recognized. So our college campuses are a big part of this. Contingent faculty organizing. Contingent faculty organizing. I don't have to tell a room full of students and faculty in higher education the importance of this, of recognizing this. This is this talk serendipitously came on the 13th anniversary of a day where I learned how precarious it is to be a contingent faculty, and is the reason I ended up, got fortunate enough to end up in the political science department. But that's a long story that I'm not going to share today. But today is an important anniversary for me. So yeah, the marriage of old labor infrastructure with increasingly radicalized younger generation is what we're seeing today. You know, the UAW knows what they're doing. They've been through this, and they can offer incredible guidance to young workers organizing. And a different National Labor Relations Board. Yeah, so those are just some of the themes that I, recognize today. Here's a photo of graduate students at Columbia. You see they've got the United Auto Worker signs. And what's important about this is that privileged white-collar communities have always been socialized to believe that unions were not for them. That worker organizing is not for them. That's for blue-collar. And of course, that's ridiculous. So, this is really important. This is big. There's a collective bargaining bill, and the impediment now, it seems to be our governor. Peeble, progressive and all but labor. And we got to work on him. So, if you believe in this issue, write letters and get involved. Because this is important. And part of this, by the way, is our own union, United Campus Workers, which is wall-to-wall union, means everyone. Food service, custodians, faculty, graduate students, together. So if any of you are interested, talk to Hill. And I'll say lastly, and then I want to introduce some of the students. I started this thing called the Colorado Labor Education Collaborative, and I thought that there is such a need for labor education, so we just started monthly programs about issues about workers' rights. And we initially were doing them in person, but then we moved them all to Zoom in the pandemic, and it's been really well attended. And these have been about everything from current issues to labor history. And so we've done some examples of what we've done is the teacher's strike. We had Mark Gaston Pierce recently talking about the NLRB. He was a former NLRB member. And so, this is Gaelic, I'm not going to tell you what it means, but I'm going to shut up, because the people that do this work are who I want you to hear from. And we are fortunate in our department to have people doing this work. It makes me so effing proud of our department. So I want to start with Darby. And Darby is Darby is a works for Spruce Coffee Chain in Boulder. They just recently won their NLRB election. Darby was a huge part of that, continues to be now. She's in the bargaining committee. And I just wanted to invite her here to tell you a little bit about that story. So thank you so much for driving all the way from Boulder to be here, Darby.
Yeah, of course. Something here. Take the mask off. Well, yeah, I'm Darby. I actually graduated from CU Denver in the political science department last semester. And yeah, I work for Spruce Confections in Boulder as a barista. Spruce has 4 retail locations and then a warehouse location, and they're about to expand to another location in Longmont. We have somewhere between 75 to 90 employees, kind of in flux as things change. And yeah, they do a lot of wholesale to a lot of coffee shops around Colorado. If you've ever been to a Ziggy's, they sell spruce products there, along with a lot of other places. And yeah, that's the general background of the place that I work for. And I have a little note on my phone that will probably help me keep on track here. I'm very good on one-to-one settings, a little more nervous in a setting like this, so just bear with me here. So yeah, we had our union election in December, which we won with BCTGM Local 26. They represent bakers, confectioners, tobacco workers, and grain millers in the Denver, Boulder, Colorado Springs-ish area. And I guess to take us all back to about exactly a year ago is when our organizing process started. So I started at Spruce in about 2019, around like 7 months before the pandemic began. And while there were agitations prior to the pandemic, I would say that that's really, you know, like for a lot of workers, what really got us mad. Mostly just the company's response to COVID generally. You know, none of us except for management had access to healthcare through the company. We were denied raises in response to the Colorado sick pay bill. And just generally felt disrespected. The company never closed to like come up with a plan for dealing with COVID. The owner was pretty MIA for a long time, and then later was like, oh, I'm sorry, if I get sick, the company's gonna go down, which just left us with the impression that we're expendable, whereas he's not. So, you know, me and my coworkers have been complaining about things for a long time. And I was part of the New Directions program for a while and took a strategic corporate research class and got connected to BCTGM through that. And I don't know, then shortly after presented the idea to some coworkers who were super down, and it kind of just went from there. So through last summer, we were kind of building what's called like an organizing committee. It started with just me and some baristas, but then soon like included bakers. We started getting into the other locations, including the warehouse location. And by around like August, September, we were gaining a lot of momentum. And I just remember this one meeting where like I looked around and there's like, I don't know, 13 or 14 of us sitting around a table and like discussing our next steps. And it was like, shit, like this is happening. Like we're really doing this. So that kind of led us into what's called Card Day. That's where within like a 24-ish hour time period, we tried to reach out and talk to as many coworkers as we could who were not already on the organizing committee and share like what we've been working on so far and, you know, the benefits that would come from this, you know, our ability to collectively bargain and ask for what we deserve. And so within that, and so the cards that people are signing are union cards that are then sent to the National Labor Relations Board. And we just needed to get 30% of the workforce to sign these cards in order to have a union election. But through the course of that day, we signed up, I think 70% of the workforce. And then within the like following week or two, I think we landed at about 80% or so. So far more than enough than we needed to have the union election, which was, I mean, it was just a very crazy time and very exciting. But shortly after that is when the owner of the business and management were notified by the National Labor Relations Board of our intention or our petition to have an election, which then informed their response, which was frazzled and they weren't excited, I would say. And I don't know, as was mentioned earlier, they hosted some like captive audience meetings. The owner hired some attorneys that are known to be pretty anti-union. And they would like kind of time these meetings where they knew there would be less employees that were like more publicly associated with the union. They were pretty strategic about the timing on those, but even so, in each meeting that he had, like there was at least one or two people that stood up to him and like, you know, called out misinformation and just generally showed that like, we're not just in it for like shits and giggles, like we're really doing this. This is real people's lives. So then that led us into the actual election period. We did like a mail-out ballot. So it was over the course of like 3 weeks that people received their ballot and had to get them sent in. And through that period of time, the management at Spruce was a lot more limited as to what they could be saying to us, without like, you know, being at risk of like having a labor charge filed against them. So going into the election, I just remember like the election day just feeling like, I don't know, so many different feelings. And when it came out, like we won by a landslide, and it felt surreal. It didn't really like set in for a long time. I feel like it's just now really feeling like, wow, like we did it, like we made it. So post-election, interestingly enough, like I thought, that's it, like we won, like what is there to really discuss here? And yet a letter was sent or hand-delivered to a lot of people kind of questioning the results of the election and insinuating that somehow we cheated, and it's not true, obviously. And yeah, that caused, unfortunately, a lot of like distrust for a while of some people that maybe were like kind of on the fence that ended up voting yes, and then being like, okay, well, what's next? Like, is this actually true? He insinuated that there would be a revote, which there was not going to be. But luckily, since then, it's moved in a much more positive direction. We are now, of course, entering into negotiations. We've had one session so far, which actually ended up going very positively. The owner actually owned up to a lot of his mistakes in this process, and the fear that he had, kind of driven by the people that he has around him, you know, his business friends telling him that this is like the worst thing in the world, like the business is going under, basically, like, I don't know. And he spoke to that and did apologize for his reaction, which was nice to hear. And we'll see how it goes going into the, you know, further into negotiations. But so far, like, everybody is feeling positively about negotiating in good faith, which is nice. Can kind of breathe a little more easily now without having to worry about that added animosity. But as far as other stuff that's changed just by winning this election, we're no longer at-will employees, meaning that we can't just be fired for any reason. And I personally have never worked a job where I'm not an at-will employee. So that in itself is really cool. And along with that, we have something called Weingarten rights, which is that we all have the right to union representation in any kind of disciplinary meeting. And already, like, that's proven useful in a situation I was in. There's been other situations where people's jobs were protected, disciplinary actions that were removed. Yeah, which is just super cool, you know? And I guess ultimately it's just really amazing that we have this opportunity to shape the workplace, you know, our daily lives essentially, and then also the lives of the people that will work at Spruce after, you know, some of us move on to other things. And then even beyond that, already there's a ripple effect happening in Boulder. You know, Boulder's a very expensive place to live. I know the case is true for a lot of my coworkers that they can't afford to live in Boulder. They're commuting from like Longmont or elsewhere, you know, just to serve the populace that can't afford to live in Boulder. And so that's of course not just a Spruce issue, it's a Boulder service industry issue. And already, I can't say who, but there's a couple other businesses that are starting the organizing process. One of which, it was like a friend of a friend who reached out to me and was like, I heard you guys did this. I want to know like how we can do it here. Like there's a lot of issues we need to address too. And I guess that might be all of it's really exciting, but I love, I don't know, just the fact that this was a historical event and just the way that it is already affecting just the consciousness of Boulder and of course like outside areas as well. So I feel like there's probably something else that I meant to mention, but I think that's just about it, so.
And we'll have time at the end for questions, if any of you have questions for the students. For many immigrant workers, day laborers who don't have a union, worker centers in urban areas are incredibly important places. And here in Denver, we have El Centro Humanitario, founded by our colleague Minsun 20 years ago or so, that continues to do important work of protecting workers. And so I want to introduce Alexis Sanchez, who has worked for El Centro for years. She's now back to finishing her studies. She spent many years running what's called the Wage Theft Action Team. So wage theft is rampant for immigrant workers. In other words, not being paid partially of what they've been promised, having their pay docked, being paid late, all of these things. So I've invited Alexis here to talk a little bit about what the Wage Theft Action Team is. So Alexis, thanks.
Hello, everyone. Yes, I guess I'll just jump right into it. I began working with El Centro Monetario while actually studying here at the university. I was in Professor Walsh's class and decided that the work that I was going to choose to do to give back to the community would be with El Centro Monetario. And so what I did there is I worked on the Wage Theft Direct Action Team. And the way that kind of started out was pretty scary. I was basically offered the opportunity to go out with one of the professors, including Professor Walsh and also another professor from DU, Rebecca Galemba, to go out to what was called Liebre, which was basically a corner where the day laborers would gather in search for work. And so I remember going out onto those corners to talk with workers and kind of just being very nervous and very scared, and so we would go out, but I quickly learned that in going out and speaking to the workers, they were very kind and very welcoming, and it was there that kind of my experience with organizing began. That's where it's so funny, I think that going to the corners, to the liebres, was probably the most incredible experience, because that was really the meat of kind of what gave me my knowledge to how to organize, right? That was where information gathering would happen, and it was all by word of mouth with the workers. So they would express to those of us that were coming out kind of what was going on in the community, how wage theft was happening, what was their experience when they were reaching out to different resources in the community, and what their response was to wage theft. And so from there, that's where I started working with wage theft and direct action specifically. I'm going to kind of dive into what that is, right? What the heck is direct action? So basically what it is it kind of starts with the process of a worker coming to the team and just telling us about their experience with wage theft. And at that point, we kind of sit back and we just listen, and we take note of kind of the most important things, basically, that we need to take note of in order to document a case, right? And so usually that would start after we've done that initial intake with a worker. We will then begin what's called negotiation process, right? At which point we are basically starting a conversation with employers and reaching out and just saying, hi, we have been contacted by this worker who has expressed that they have not received their wages from you. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? And at that point, usually we get to know the employer a little bit better, and we kind of know how we're going to start to begin to navigate what we call direct action. And so usually, we'll get an employer who's either going to work with us or an employer who we quickly realize is not going to work with us, right? And so that might look like an employer not responding to the phone calls that we've kind of tried to reach out to them. At which point we would escalate, is what we would call this. We would escalate direct action by then going out and doing what's called a delegation. And the delegation is where we might go visit an employer personally, whether that's at their home address or their business address. whatever address we can use to find them, right, and bring this issue to their attention, and just let them know this problem is not going to go away. This worker is not just going to go away. And so what's really great is we're drawing, in this process, right, we're drawing attention, and we're bringing attention of not only the employer, but we, as much as we can, we bring the attention of the entire community. And so at that point, the delegation may or may not go well, at which point, if it does go well, obviously negotiations then continue. If it doesn't go well, then again, we may escalate direct action tactic. And so if we have an employer that we've gone out and we've said, hey, like you're not returning our phone calls, can we talk about this? We will then escalate to flyering houses, and kind of just, what we'll do is we'll knock on doors and just let neighbors know, and most times this happens in a neighborhood, so it's a private address that we're going to for the employer. But we'll go around the neighborhood and knock on doors and just say, hey, do you know that your neighbor has not paid their worker? And we have to be very careful about what we're saying when we go out and do this, right? But so we just state exactly what we know. Do you know that your neighbor has not paid their worker, right? And then so we're bringing, again, the point is to bring more attention here at this point. So once we have the neighbor's attention and we have the employer's attention at that point, we can then escalate once more again to a protest in front of that residential area. And we can be very, very annoying at a very, very early time. I think my favorites are on Sundays, usually around 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning, when we're making a ruckus. And so usually at that point that might lead to a protest. And then at that point, what the team has gotten to do is we just escalate and we escalate those direct action tactics until we get to a point where we cannot escalate anymore, right? Because either we're not getting an employer who's responding to us, or they're not responding to any of these tactics, right? And so at that point, we might offer a different course of action that is not direct action. And for me, I prefer the direct action route much more, because we're starting a conversation directly between the employer and the worker, right? We're avoiding this very procedural, very dry approach, in my opinion, to combating this issue of wage theft, which is going the legal route. And so what does that legal route even look like, right? I'll be honest, when I first started with the team, I was like, I mean, what do? You call the police? What do you do if your boss steals from you? And so you go through the small claims court process. And so this process in and of itself can be problematic, because one of the very first steps to that process is actually delivering what's called a demand letter, where and a demand letter, the way that our team preface these demand letters is it usually starts by citing Colorado statutes that explicitly say, hey, what you're doing is illegal. And you can be punished in the court of law for this, right? And so when we deliver that demand letter, we have to show the judge when we go to small claims court that demand letter was given to the employer, that they were given notice of this issue. Not that they don't know, but that we need to prove and document that notice was given, right? And then it gives the employer about 2 weeks to respond. And to some extent, we can use that first process of the legal process as a direct action step, right? Because we're then putting pressure on the employer by using legal pressure, so to speak, right? But one of the issues is that if we don't have record of this notice being given, then it kind of just starts that process all over again. Meaning that the workers will then have to go spend more time in court. They're spending more time, right, to earn their wages, even though they've already worked the hours to have earned those wages, right? And so it becomes a very difficult ask of, even when we're working alongside workers for these wage theft issues, right? It becomes an even bigger ask, because now you're coming to us and you're asking, hey, what can I do about this? And we're saying, hey, I'm going to need more of your time. away from your families, even though you're spending all this time working, right? And so moving forward, so some of the issues we've encountered is that an employer, like I said, will try and dodge all of these notices, right? And I'll give you an example. We actually just had a delegation this past week where we went out to an employer and tried to hand deliver in person this demand letter. And I just want to kind of give some context to what workers could experience, right? So we went with the worker to the employer's home, and what ended up happening is that the employer came outside, and when we tried to hand them this demand letter, they became very aggressive. Began shouting and just saying a bunch of things, and even threatened us physically and verbally. And so I have to say that, I can't even imagine what that would have felt like having gone there by myself as a worker, right? But what the direct action team does is we go together in solidarity. So there's 3 or 4 of us, right? And then it doesn't maybe feel as scary when you're going up and knocking at the door, when an employer's shouting in your face. But yes, so the issue with the legal route is that, sometimes, again, that process is just going to be put on the back burner more and more because the employer is allowed to do this, is because there's no enforcement behind this, right? And just to show the lack of enforcement around this, right, the employer that we visited actually called the cops. And so when the cops came, to our surprise, they said, well, this is a civil dispute. We really can't do anything about it. Well, actually, in 2019, a law was passed that it is you can be charged, and it is a crime for the amount over $7,000. It is a felony to steal this amount of wages from a worker. And what the worker that we were going with what he was owed was $9,000. So actually, and I've had students ask this question, can't you just call law enforcement to enforce these statutes? If there's protections, can't they just enforce these statutes? Well, the issue is that there's lack of labor education, as Professor Walsh pointed out. And so these police officers said it's a civil suit, and I sat there and expressed, well, actually it's not. It's a felony, and they said, well, take it to court. And I said, well, that's what we're doing. We're trying to start the first part of that process by delivering this demand letter. And then what happens after someone goes to court, right? I've expressed this a million times, but a worker then has to present their case in small claims court, because in small claims court, you cannot that's not a place where you can hire an attorney to represent your case to the judge. In small claims court, a worker must tell their story to the judge. And so what happens with that? Well, employers have threatened immigration, calling immigration, and employers have threatened physical violence. And so sometimes we have seen that these tactics that these employers are using, they work. Workers get scared and they then say, okay, well, this isn't really worth all my time, right? I could be taken away from my family. There's all these risk factors, right, that happen. And then after that, right, even after going to small claims court, you can receive a judgment from the judge that says, yes, you won your case, this employer owes you money. However, it is your responsibility, the worker's responsibility, to enforce that judgment. So again, we can offer this recourse of going to small claims court, and you can even win in small claims court, but then we still have this issue of, okay, how are we going to enforce this? And this is a very real issue, because we've dealt with employers who have gone that far, who have gotten this judgment, and they're like, I don't care, I'll file for bankruptcy. I don't care, I will blackball you in this industry with all my connections, so it's fine. And so, so for me, that is what the one thing that I really loved about the direct action team is, you can kind of say, screw the procedure, screw this long, lengthy process that just, in my opinion, in my experience, takes more away from you. And you can you get to go out into the field and you get to address these issues directly. Like I said, going out on a protest, going out to the corner to inform ourselves of what's going on in the community. And so yes, I'm sorry, I'm sure I was all over the place as well. I'm also very nervous, but I believe that is kind of just the gist of what I wanted to cover as far as what the direct action team does. And I will just say that really quickly that, you know, the team is made of workers in the community. There have been workers we have worked alongside in cases who have now become a part of the team. There's students, there's community activists. And at this worker center here in Denver, in my experience, I was able to plug in on so many different levels that I had no idea was even possible. I mean, going to this worker center, we were able to plug in and work with other nonprofits who also advocated to raise the minimum wage. The El Centro members were able to be a part of that process as well and help in that effort. So I do want to highlight that, as Professor Walsh did mention, that immigrant workers are often in the front line of these movements, right? And so yes, so this was my experience with that, and yeah, so thank you all very much for your time.
Thanks, Alexis. Thank you. And the final student we're going to hear from is Hill, who's one of our New Directions labor leadership students. I met Hill at a rally for the postal workers during the Trump years, and he's now not only in our New Directions program, he's also a leader in the CWA. So, Hill, thank you.
Yeah. As Professor Walsh mentioned, I am a graduate student in the New Directions program studying labor leadership and politics. And I also sit on the executive board of CWA 7799, which is a local representing public sector workers in the libraries, in healthcare, and then here throughout the University of Colorado system. And this union sort of came about within University of Colorado in Boulder when a group of grad students formed a union amongst themselves to organize for better working conditions, as we all do. And we talk about the changing consciousness of workers, which we see there. We're also talking about the changing consciousness of organized labor, which has for decades been called and considered a sleeping giant. And so whether it's Starbucks or whether it's soft labor, such as grad student workers, programmers, coding, we see this old union infrastructure like the United Auto Workers, but also with CWA, which is Communications Workers of America, which traditionally represented phone operators, was how it got its start, and then broader telecommunications, and here in Denver, taxis, which are things you're seeing less and less of alongside with auto manufacturing. So we're seeing unions change consciousness, awaken from their sleep as these giants, and we're seeing workers organize with these unions in sectors that aren't what you would consider traditional union sectors. They're not factories, it's not construction, it's baristas, it's graduate students, it's librarians. And we talk about how the public sector unions emerged in the 60s and 70s, and a lot of it was around civil rights. I think for our union, especially, we still see a lot of that because, what's more under attack in terms of civil rights, in terms of politics, than sectors in education and libraries, books, education, like whether it's critical race theory or conservative groups targeting left-wing professors, that's civil rights, you know? And Professor Walsh mentioned the collective bargaining law and collective bargaining in general, which is basically the election process, which is being able to organize around a contract and then being able to enforce that contract. And right now in Colorado, those rights do not extend to the public sector, which means that public sector employers, which are often faceless, really, I don't know who the boss is of CU for real, they're not under any obligation to recognize or bargain, negotiate with unions, whether or not they have a majority of members, whether or not they win an election, which is a right they're often not awarded to give. And we see that all over the state. Once Douglas County, which is a pretty traditionally conservative district, once their school board had a conservative majority, they basically stopped negotiating with their teachers' unions. They stopped recognizing that as the collective bargaining force for their teachers. And so we tried to pass this collective bargaining bill, but we also are building a model of organizing outside of the traditional election, traditional contract structure, which is what we call a wall-to-wall minority union, meaning that any employee of the CU system, from your part-time student worker to a dean of a school, is eligible to join. And we're not necessarily focused on having a majority of members, but by building a culture of unionism and building a culture in which workers of the CU system or of the libraries or of healthcare can address their problems with each other and with the system in general. What that allows us to do is operate openly. When we're not working towards an election, we can be, hey, we are the union, we represent these workers. It allows us to, in the moment, figure out demands and build pressure campaigns around them to get those demands met, and to build an infrastructure and a culture that makes every member of the union into an organizer. It means that you can start with one person, and then everyone in that department, or just friends of this person, become part of the union, working on enforcing whatever grievances they have. And through that, we've won a raise for grad workers in CU, guaranteed paternity leave, and a waiver for student fees for grad students, so they're no longer paying to be able to work for the university. Woo. And you know, the CU system, they're not going to say the union demanded this and then we did it, but there's a pattern of the union demanding it and then them, you know, following through on that. So whether it's the consciousness of workers, I know this is pretty brief, or just the working class in general, or 7799, public sector workers, the real message here is that they can ignore you and they can ignore your feelings until you organize, and then they can't ignore you for as long as they can. That's pretty much all I had. Thank you.
Well, we have a little bit of time, maybe 10 minutes, and I just thought we could open this up a little bit and maybe also have our three student guests field questions as well. So, sorry, Ellie?
Oh, we have a few questions from online.
Oh, okay, I have some online. Okay, I'm not, should we start with the in-person people or the online people? I don't know. But yeah, let's just open this up, and we'd love to hear from you, your thoughts, your questions, and the three of you want to come on up here? want to center our students here a little bit. But yeah, so before we go to the online folks, what about for those of you here in the room? We'd love to hear from you. Anything on your minds that any of us have provoked, thoughts or questions? So, go ahead, Quinn.
Yeah, so I actually had a question for you. It's a pretty brief one, but you were talking about how public sector workers have some of the highest union membership rates in the country at about like 35%, I think you said. I wanted to know, just out of curiosity, like what percentage of that would be, or if they're even included, would be police unions? Because I know historically throughout the 20th century they had a history of basically just being union busters, and then they took a lot of the tactics and put those into their own unions. So I wanted to know if that was part of that number.
It is part of that percentage. I don't know what part of that 35% are police unions. As you know, Quinn, police unions are a very controversial part of the labor movement today, given the role of, Black Lives Matters and police brutality I think that's definitely a source of tension within the movement, is how, I would add to that prison guard unions as well. And I think everyone I know in the movement struggles with that, because the labor movement wants to position itself as a voice of human rights, always has. But yeah, that's a big issue. Yeah. Yeah. Yes?
You spoke about contingent employees and faculty organization for contingent employees. Does it extend to community college? Because it seems to me, if there's someone who's really exploited in terms of being at-will employees and having what I think is very little in the way of any rights from semester to semester, and, easily to just simply not renew a contract from one semester to another. If contingent faculty organizations are including community college part-time.
Yeah, Hill might know more about this than I do, actually. But, I'll just say that the issue of contingency is huge. And not just in higher ed, but in every industry. And where I was so pleased to hear Darby talk about not being at will for the first time in her life, and think about that. but that's where we're at today. That this is the biggest issue, and I don't know really what's going on at the community college level to speak. I don't know enough about that to speak directly to it. I wish I did. But if anyone in this room might be able to talk to you after we finish, does anyone want to? There you go, the gentleman there in the green shirt. Talk to him afterwards. So, thank you, Mark. Yeah. Others, yes.
One of the things that I'm impressed with right now, your discussion of what I think it seems organic growth, that you start here with the local employees and they move forward, which is really, I guess, the history of labor movements in the first place. So the question is, in terms of if you kind of fast forward, let's say 20, 30 years from now, and we know what happened, for example, with the past union movement and the decline, as Professor Walsh pointed out, how do you begin to think about dealing with that? What are the tactics that caused essentially the demise, of that? How can you ensure at least decrease the probability that that won't happen to this new group of organic folks?
Yeah, I think for my position with Darby, a lot of we were there for the organizing campaigns, right? We work in a restaurant or school or whatever, and then organized, started from very little, got more with the contract, but then the contract's there and employees come and go, workers come and go. So you don't see what went into creating the benefits. So it's easy to look at it as your average worker and say, oh, I'm just paying $15 a month for seemingly no reason. So I think the question in stopping that from happening is a question of member engagement within unions, making more of the education, making sure that history is well known, making sure it's not just procedure, and that people are actually engaged and know what's happening within the unions and within the workplace.
Yeah, if I can add on, just emphasizing, personal relationships with coworkers, something that we're, really have pushed the whole time of the organizing process. We're really emphasizing now is just getting together still outside of work and making sure that we're, fostering that sense of community. And I think that can help with the longevity of the union. Yeah.
Robert?
Really quick, I want to say I'm inspired by the work you guys have done, and to see the group up in Boulder rallying with Spruce and sort of you all being joined together. And then, of course, CWA 7799. I'm a CWA member, 37074, Denver Labor Guild. But I did want to mention one thing. That public worker collective bargaining bill, I'll be honest, it's touch and go, and the governor is a problem. And if you support it, I do have a phone number you can call. It has my voice saying the exact same thing written here. You can leave give a message, really from the heart and from your own experience. I appreciate anyone who could make a call. I did want to ask Darby a question though. Outside of face-to-face interactions, how do you guys stay in touch, and is there anything that's worked for you within that, or is it in-person meetings and face-to-face?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Actually, something that I was addressing with like a small group last night, because primarily so far we've like our organizing committee has communicated through group texts, which can be great, can also be horrible. So we're trying to figure out if like there's another way that we can distinguish like the most important information that everybody needs to know, and then like a conversation thread. So we're trying to still navigate that a little bit, and then also like email. And lately, as COVID is, as we know, gotten worse and better, and we've existed in different ways. We've been meeting some in person, some online, and now we're going to move towards like a hybrid format, so people that are more comfortable being away or ill, or I don't know, we just find it's more accessible if there is an option to be online, but also like having that face-to-face interaction is really important, as I'm sure we all know, living through a pandemic for 2 years. So, yeah.
Yes?
Question for, I just saw last night that Target has raised their minimum wage from $15 to $24. So my question is, by raising the minimum wage, does the products that they sell will get more expensive, or how would they pay that extra to their employees?
Thank you. I think it's always been the campaign to keep wages low. Part of that campaign has always been, they're just going to raise the standard of living and make things more expensive as consumers. And workers have to keep pushing back against that. So workers can't control inflation. They can't control consumer prices. What they can control is fighting for a dignified wage. And I think that has to always be the focus. But there has been some data gathered over the years that sort of flies in the face of the idea that when wages go up, it just means that consumer prices are raised as well. So that's kind of up for debate. So, but thank you for that question. Yeah. Do you want to read the online ones real quick, and then if those of us who want to respond to any of them, we could, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, 1 second, let me find it. Oh, no, I'm in class at 2.
Oh, is there a class in here too?
Yeah, they're all hanging out.
Okay, we'll wrap it up in 2 minutes. Tell everybody 2 minutes. Sorry.
Okay, really quick. Are companies actually implementing any open door policies to back up the rhetoric? And if so, what do they look like? And have they been effective in preventing unionization?
Are companies implementing open door policies?
You might say they are.
Yeah. Joe, do you want to speak to that? One of our labor instructors, Joe, has a long history in organizing. I consider a real expert in some of this stuff. Do you want to quickly address that?
What was the question? I interrupted myself.
Okay. Do you want to read it one more time, and then we're going to have to wrap it up.
Yeah. Sorry, I popped it down. Are companies actually implementing any open door policies to back up the rhetoric? And if so, what do they look like? And have they been effective in preventing unionization?
Well, in the course of an organizing drive, a company will in fact engage in very different behaviors that led to the organizing drive. And one of the things the boss will do is he says, I have an open door. Come in and talk to me. We don't need a union to interfere with our relationship. We want to have a direct relationship. So bosses almost always use that policy, and union busters really have perfected it.
Listen, everyone, we need to surrender the room, but any of you interested in our labor program, please talk to this man. Thank you so much.